silent for 680 days. Then a tiny kitten slept between his paws. The night pressed against the cabin like something alive. Wind tore through the pines with a voice that sounded almost human, and branches scratched at the windows in rhythms that seemed deliberate, insistent. George stood at the glass, one weathered hand pressed against the cold pane, watching the darkness swallow the forest beyond. The trees bent and swayed, their silhouettes writhing against a sky that held no stars. November in Montana could be cruel, and tonight felt particularly unforgiving. He pulled the window shut with more force than necessary, the old frame groaning in protest. The sudden silence felt heavy, broken only by the whisper of wind finding its way through cracks in the timber. George turned toward the small bedroom, rubbing his arms against the chill that seemed to seep through his bones no matter how high he kept the fire. "Come to bed. It's getting cold," he called out, his voice rougher than he remembered it being. When had he gotten so old? The question surfaced unbidden, the way such thoughts often did in the empty hours. He waited for the familiar response, the soft padding of paws across the wooden floor, the weight of a small body landing on the bed. Nothing came. George frowned, moving through the cabin's 2 rooms with growing unease. He checked under the table, behind the armchair, in the bathroom. No cream-colored ball of fur, no green eyes reflecting lamplight. Milo, his voice carried an edge now. He returned to the bedroom, pulled back the quilted blanket he'd made with his late wife 20 years ago, as if the cat might somehow be hiding in the folds. The bed was empty, cold. That's when memory struck him with the force of a physical blow. Earlier, when he'd stepped onto the porch to bring in more firewood, the door had stood open for maybe 3 minutes. Long enough. More than long enough. No, no, no. The word became a prayer, a denial. George grabbed his flashlight from the kitchen drawer, his hands shaking so badly it took 3 tries. He threw on his heavy coat, not bothering with the buttons, and wrenched open the door. The wind hit him like a fist, stealing his breath. Rain had begun to fall, not the gentle spring rain that nourished the earth, but the cold, punishing rain of late autumn that felt like shards of ice. Within seconds, his face was numb, water running into his eyes and down his collar. "Milo." The wind swallowed his voice, threw it back at him. "Milo, come here, boy." The beam of his flashlight cut weak paths through the darkness, illuminating curtains of rain and little else. George stumbled down the porch steps, nearly losing his footing on the slick wood. The mountain path that led away from his cabin had turned to mud, treacherous and slippery. He'd walked this path 1,000 times, knew every root and stone, but tonight it felt alien, hostile. His boots sank into the muck with each step, branches whipped at his face, and he pushed them aside blindly, calling Milo's name until his throat felt raw. How far could a house cat go in 3 minutes? How fast? The questions tormented him as he climbed higher, the path growing steeper. His breath came in ragged gasps, his chest burning with the effort. At 73, his body wasn't built for this anymore. He slipped, one foot sliding out from under him. George threw out his arms for balance, the flashlight spinning from his grip and tumbling down the slope. He watched its beam cartwheel through the darkness before disappearing. For a moment, he knelt there in the mud and rain, listening to his heart hammer against his ribs, tasting copper and fear. "Please," he whispered to the uncaring night. "Please, I can't lose him too." 6 miles away, at the Mountain Haven Sanctuary, Marcus was making his final rounds of the evening. The conservation facility sprawled across 80 acres of protected forest, home to 23 rescued big cats and several other species that had been pulled from the illegal wildlife trade or saved from situations where they could no longer survive in the wild. Marcus had worked here for 7 years, and he knew every animal, every enclosure, every routine. He was checking the perimeter cameras when something caught his eye. A flash of movement in Sector 7, the restricted zone. He leaned closer to the monitor, adjusting the contrast. There shouldn't be anything in that area. That was Ghost territory, and Ghost didn't tolerate company. He rewound the footage, enhanced the image. His blood went cold. A cat. A small domestic cat, cream-colored, distinctly not a wild animal, was trotting along the fence line with the casual confidence of an animal that had no idea where it was. Marcus watched in horror as the cat found a gap near the drainage culvert, a space barely wide enough, a breach no one had noticed. The cat squeezed through. Oh God! Marcus was already running, grabbing his radio, calling for backup. We have a breach in Sector 7, domestic animal inside Ghost's enclosure. I need everyone now, Ghost. Of all the animals in the sanctuary, the female snow leopard was the most fragile, the most unpredictable. She'd been rescued 18 months ago from a trafficking operation in Nevada, pulled from a cage so small she couldn't turn around, kept in darkness, fed spoiled meat and dirty water. But the worst part, the part that broke everyone's heart, was what they discovered during her initial medical examination. She had been pregnant when captured. The stress, the conditions, the trauma had caused her to lose the entire litter. Since arriving at Mountain Haven, Ghost had been a phantom of herself. She wouldn't eat more than was necessary to survive. She ignored enrichment activities, toys, anything designed to stimulate her. She would lie in the furthest corner of her enclosure, staring at nothing, as if willing herself to disappear. Dr. Sarah Winters, the head veterinarian, had been beside herself with worry. Ghost was wasting away. Her beautiful coat had lost its luster. Her eyes were dull, and her weight had dropped to dangerous levels. Every attempt to help her had failed. She simply didn't want to live. And now there was a domestic cat in her territory. Marcus reached the enclosure at the same time as Sarah and two other staff members. They approached cautiously, flashlights cutting through the rain. The outdoor portion of Ghost's habitat included artificial rock formations, scattered trees, and a heated den structure. At night, she usually retreated into the den, but the cameras showed she was outside, near the eastern outcropping. "Do you see the cat?" Sarah whispered. Marcus scanned the area with night vision binoculars. He found Ghost first, her pale form ghostly in the green-tinted view. She was sitting upright, alert, staring at something. He adjusted focus, following her gaze. There, the cream-colored cat sat about 15 feet away, calmly grooming itself as if it had simply wandered into someone's backyard. It seemed utterly unaware of the apex predator watching it with unwavering attention. "We need to tranquilize Ghost and extract the cat," Marcus said urgently. "Now, before—" "Wait!" Sarah's hand shot out, gripping his arm. "Look at Ghost." They all looked. Ghost was moving, but not in the way they expected. She wasn't stalking, wasn't crouching in the predatory stance they'd seen 1,000 times. She was approaching slowly, her movements almost tentative. The cat looked up, finally seeming to notice the snow leopard. But instead of bolting, instead of hissing or arching its back, the cat simply sat there, tail wrapped around its paws, watching. Ghost stopped a few feet away. For a long moment, the two animals simply regarded each other. Then Ghost lowered herself to the ground, making herself smaller, less threatening. She made a sound, a soft chuffing noise that came from deep in her chest. Sarah felt tears spring to her eyes. "That's a maternal call," she breathed. "She's treating it like a cub." They watched in stunned silence as the small cat stood, walked directly to Ghost, and bumped its head against the snow leopard's much larger one. Ghost's eyes, which had been empty and dead for so many months, suddenly looked alive. She lowered her massive head and gently nosed the cat, guiding it toward her. The cat circled once, then settled against Ghost's belly, purring loudly enough that they could hear it from the fence line. Ghost curled around the cat, her body forming a protective barrier. She continued to chuff softly, the sound of a mother comforting her young. Then she rested her head on her paws and closed her eyes. Within minutes, both animals were asleep. No one moved, no one spoke. They stood in the rain, watching something that shouldn't be possible, something that defied every rule of nature they knew. Finally, Sarah found her voice. "We need to monitor this constantly, but I don't think we should intervene. Not yet, not unless there's immediate danger." "But how long can this last?" Marcus asked. "Tomorrow, when she's hungry, when her instincts kick in." "I don't know," Sarah admitted. "But look at her, Marcus, really look. That's the first time she's shown any spark of life since she got here. I'm not sure we have the right to take that away from her. Or from the cat. Morning came gray and reluctant. George hadn't slept. He'd searched for hours in the rain before finally admitting defeat and returning home, soaked through, shivering violently, calling Milo's name with a voice that no longer worked. He'd changed into dry clothes mechanically, made coffee he couldn't drink, and sat at the kitchen table staring at nothing. The cabin felt enormous in its emptiness. Every corner held a memory of Milo. The windowsill where he loved to sun himself, the spot on the rug where he would stretch out, impossibly long, belly exposed, the way he would sit on the arm of the chair while George read, one paw extended to touch his shoulder as if to say, I'm here. You're not alone. George had found Milo 3 years ago, after his wife Margaret had been gone for 2. The loneliness had been suffocating, a weight that pressed down on his chest until some days he wasn't sure he wanted to draw another breath. He'd been driving back from town, a pointless errand just to have somewhere to go, when he'd seen the cardboard box on the side of the road. He almost didn't stop, almost kept driving. But something made him pull over, made him get out of the truck and walk back to the box. Inside, wrapped in a stained towel, was the smallest kitten he'd ever seen, cream-colored, eyes still clouded, body cold. It made a sound like a question, weak and desperate. George had scooped up the kitten, box and all, and driven straight home. He'd warmed milk, fed the tiny thing with an eyedropper, wrapped it in the softest blanket he could find. Through that first night, he'd sat up in his chair, holding the kitten against his chest, feeling its heartbeat flutter like a bird's wing, terrified it would stop, terrified he would be alone again. But the kitten had lived, thrived, became Milo, named after Margaret's father, who had been kind and gentle and steady. Milo had given George a reason to get up in the morning, to buy groceries, to keep the fire going. The cat had quite literally saved his life by giving him something to live for. And now Milo was gone, lost in the forest, or worse, the thought of that small body out in the cold, frightened, calling for help that wouldn't come, it was unbearable. As soon as it was light enough, George got in his truck. He would drive to the sanctuary. It was a long shot, but the facility was a few miles from his cabin, and animals sometimes wandered near it. Maybe someone there had seen something. Maybe. The Mountain Haven Sanctuary sat behind tall fences, with signs warning visitors about the dangerous animals within. George had driven past it 100 times, but had never been inside. He parked in the visitor lot, which was empty this early, and walked to the main building on unsteady legs. A young woman at the reception desk looked up with a professional smile that faded when she saw his face. Sir, are you all right? George pulled out his phones with shaking hands, found the photo. My cat, he said, his voice cracking. He got out last night. Have you seen him, please? Have you seen him? The receptionist's eyes widened as she looked at the photo. Wait here, she said, already reaching for her phone. Please, just wait right here. Within minutes, Sarah Winters appeared, followed by Marcus and 2 other staff members. Sarah approached George gently, the way one might approach a wounded animal. Sir, what's your name? George. George Patterson, my cat, Milo. He's... Mr. Patterson, I need you to come with me. Your cat is here. He's safe. The relief was so intense, George thought his legs might give out. He's here, he's really here. Yes, but there's something you need to see, something we need to explain. They led him to a monitoring room filled with screens showing various animal enclosures. Sarah pulled up footage from the night before, the timestamp showing 10:15 p.m. This is your cat, isn't it? George watched the small cream figure slip through a gap in the fence. Yes, that's Milo. Where did he go? Where is he? He went into one of our enclosures, specifically into the habitat of a rescued snow leopard named Ghost. Sarah paused, choosing her words carefully. Mr. Patterson, in any normal circumstance, a domestic cat entering a big cat's territory it would not end well, but this situation is anything but normal. She switched to a live feed. George leaned forward, squinting at the screen. At first, he couldn't process what he was seeing. There was a large pale cat, clearly a wild animal, lying on its side and curled against its belly, sleeping peacefully. was Milo. I don't understand, George whispered. Sarah explained Ghost's history, her trauma, her pregnancy loss, her decline. She's been dying inside, Mr. Patterson, refusing to engage with life. We were genuinely worried we were going to lose her. But last night, when your cat appeared, something changed. She's treating him like her cub. She's alive again. George watched the screen, saw the way Ghost's massive paw rested protectively over Milo, the way she would occasionally open one eye to check on him, the absolute peace on both their faces. We need to discuss what happens next, Marcus said quietly. Obviously, you want your cat back. We understand that. But we also need to consider Ghost. If we separate them now, after she's finally found something to live for, you think it would hurt her, George said. It wasn't a question. We think it might break her completely, Sarah admitted. But this is your pet, your companion. We have no right to ask you to give that up. We just needed you to see this, to understand the situation. George continued to stare at the screen. He thought about Milo, how the cat had saved him from drowning in grief, how Milo had been abandoned once already, left in a box to die, and George had given him a home, a life, love. The idea of giving that up felt like losing Margaret all over again. But he also thought about the snow leopard on the screen, about what Sarah had described. Ghost had been kept in darkness, in filth, had lost her babies to human cruelty. She'd given up on living, until Milo. The question formed slowly in his mind, and when he spoke, his voice was steady for the first time that morning. Can I see them in person? They took him to Ghost's enclosure, approaching the viewing area quietly. Through the reinforced glass, George could see them clearly now. Ghost was awake, watching as Milo, no longer sleeping, batted at a fallen leaf. But she wasn't just watching, she was engaged, alert, her eyes tracking every movement with what looked like concern and affection. When Milo wandered too close to the water feature, Ghost made a low sound and the cat immediately trotted back to her side. George pressed his hand against the glass. Milo, he said softly. The cat's ears swiveled at his voice, and for a moment George thought he would come running, would recognize him and want to come home. But Milo simply looked at him, then looked back at Ghost, and butted his head against her leg. The snow leopard leaned down and gently groomed the top of his head with her rough tongue. In that moment, George understood. Milo wasn't lost. He had found something George couldn't give him. And Ghost had found what humans couldn't provide, despite all their efforts and expertise. I need to think, George said. Can I come back tomorrow? Of course, Sarah said. Mr. Patterson, we know this is difficult. Take all the time you need. But George was already forming an idea, a possibility that felt both crazy and absolutely right. As he drove home, his mind raced. By the time he pulled it to his driveway, he knew what he was going to do. That evening, George returned to the sanctuary with the bag. Sarah met him at the entrance, surprised to see him back so soon. I'm not taking him home, George said before she could speak. At least, not the way you think, but I'm not leaving him either. If this is going to work, if Ghost and Milo are going to be together, then I need to be here too. I found that cat half dead and gave him a life. I'm not going to abandon him just because his life looks different than I planned. Mr. Patterson, I'm not sure what you're proposing. I'm proposing that I become part of this, however that works. I want to be involved in their care. I want to see Milo every day. If Ghost is going to be his mother, then I'm going to be, he paused, searching for the right word, part of their family, however that's possible. Sarah studied his face for a long moment. Come with me. She took him to the enclosure. It was late afternoon, the golden light slanting through the trees. She positioned him near the fence, where there was a flat stone that could serve as a seat. Just sit, she said. Let them get used to you being here. George sat through the fence. He could see Ghost and Milo resting under an artificial rock overhang. Ghost's eyes opened immediately, fixing on him with an intensity that made his breath catch. She rose smoothly to her feet, moving between Milo and the fence, protective. It's okay, girl, George said softly. I'm not here to take him. I just want to be near him. Is that all right? He reached into his bag and pulled out a worn paperback, one of the mysteries Margaret had loved. He opened it to a random page and began to read aloud, his voice carrying across the enclosure. At first, Ghost remained tense, watchful, but gradually, as George continued to read, her posture relaxed. She settled back down, though she kept her eyes on him. Milo, curious about the familiar voice, took a few steps toward the fence. Ghost made a sound and Milo stopped, looking back at her. Some communication passed between them, and Milo returned to Ghost's side. George read for an hour, until his voice grew hoarse. When he finally closed the book, he was startled to see that Ghost had moved closer, drawn by the sound. She was only about 10 feet from the fence now, lying in a position where she could watch both him and Milo. Same time tomorrow, George asked. Though he wasn't sure who he was talking to, Ghost's ear twitched, which he decided to take as acknowledgement. Over the following days, a routine established itself. George would arrive in the afternoon and sit by the fence. He brought books, some of the same ones he'd read to Margaret during her final months in the hospital. He read poetry, novels, articles from National Geographic. His voice became a constant, a presence that Ghost began to associate with safety. On the fourth day, something remarkable happened. George was reading a passage about Montana's wilderness when Milo trotted right up to the fence. The gaps were too small for him to fit through. They'd reinforced that section immediately after the initial incident, but Milo could press his face close. He began to purr, loud and rumbling. "Hey, buddy," George whispered, pressing his fingers as close as he could. "I've missed you too." Ghost watched this interaction carefully. Then, to everyone's amazement, she stood and walked toward the fence as well. She didn't come as close as Milo, but close enough. She sat down, wrapped her tail around her paws, and simply observed. It wasn't aggression, it was assessment. She was trying to understand what this human meant to her adopted cub. George met her eyes. "Thank you," he said simply. "Thank you for taking care of him." Sarah, watching from a distance, felt tears stream down her face. Marcus stood beside her, equally moved. "I don't believe what I'm seeing," he murmured. "Believe it," Sarah said. "We're watching something unprecedented." George's routine expanded. He began bringing items from home, a blanket that smelled like his cabin, small cloth sachets filled with herbs from Margaret's old garden. He'd hang the sachets where Ghost could reach them if she chose. At first, she ignored them, but gradually, curiosity won. She would approach when George wasn't there, sniff the herbs, and eventually, she began to rub against them, to lie near them. The staff documented everything. Amazed. Winter arrived with its first serious snow in late November. The temperature dropped below freezing, and George showed up with an extra blanket, thick in wool. He pushed it through a feeder slot near the ground. Calling Milo's name, the cat came immediately, sniffing the blanket with obvious recognition. Then something magical happened. Milo grabbed a corner of the blanket in his teeth and began dragging it toward Ghost. Struggling with the weight, he'd pull a few inches, rest, pull again. It was clear what he wanted. Ghost watched this performance with what could only be described as amusement. Finally, she stood and walked over to the blanket. She sniffed it thoroughly, taking in George's scent, the smell of his cabin, the lingering aroma of wood smoke and coffee. Then she carefully picked up one corner in her mouth and helped Milo drag it to their sleeping spot under the overhang. She arranged the blanket with her paws, then settled on it, pulling Milo close. The cat burrowed against her, a cream-colored comma against her pale fur. Ghost looked toward the fence, toward George, and for the first time since her rescue, she made direct, meaningful eye contact with a human. She blinked slowly, deliberately, in the language of cats, domestic and wild. It was a gesture of trust. George blinked back, tears freezing on his weathered cheeks. The breakthrough came on a brutally cold afternoon in December. George had arrived as usual, but he was moving stiffly, his arthritis flaring in the cold. As he settled onto his stone seat, his foot slipped on a patch of ice. He went down hard, crying out as pain shot through his hip. Immediately, Milo began making distressed sounds, running back and forth along the fence line, his cries sharp and urgent. Ghost was on her feet instantly, Moving to where George had fallen, she paced, agitated, making low vocalizations that brought staff running. "I'm all right," George insisted, though he clearly wasn't. Marcus and another worker helped him up, supporting his weight. "Just bruised. I'm fine." But Ghost wasn't satisfied. She remained at the fence, watching intently as they helped George to the medical building. For the first time since her arrival, she gave a warning growl to the humans, a sound that said clearly, "Be careful with him. Don't hurt him." George was treated for a bruised hip and sent home with instructions to rest for a few days. He hated being away, worried about how Ghost and Milo would react to his absence. Sarah called him that evening with an update. "She's looking for you, Boone," Sarah said. "Ghost keeps returning to the spot where you usually sit. She's restless. Even Milo seems anxious. I think you need to come back as soon as you can manage it." George returned 2 days later, walking with a cane. As soon as he approached the enclosure, Ghost appeared from the den, with Milo close behind. She hurried to the fence, making soft chuffing sounds. It was the closest George had ever heard to distress in her voice. "I'm okay," he told her, lowering himself carefully to his seat. "She's still here. I wouldn't leave you two." Ghost paced for several minutes before finally settling, though she remained closer to the fence than usual. Milo sat beside her, both of them watching George with concern that seemed almost human in its intensity. It was Margaret's birthday in mid-December, and George felt the weight of her absence particularly hard that day. He came to the sanctuary as usual but couldn't bring himself to read. He simply sat, staring at nothing, tears running silently down his face. Milo noticed immediately. The cat began pacing, moving between Ghost and the fence, clearly distressed by George's emotional state. Ghost watched her adopted cub's agitation, then turned her attention to George. For a long moment, she simply stared at him. Then she did something that shocked everyone watching on the monitors. Ghost approached the fence, closer than she'd ever come, and she sat down directly across from George. She didn't make a sound. She simply sat there, a presence, a witness to his grief. In the wild, cats often sit vigil with pack members who are wounded or grieving. Ghost was offering the only comfort she could, her presence. George looked up, meeting her eyes. "My wife died 3 years ago," he told her, his voice broken. "Today was her birthday. I miss her so much. Some days I don't know how to keep going. But then Milo came into my life, and he gave me a reason, and now he's found you, and you need him. It's like she sent him to me, and then sent him to you. I don't know if I believe in things like that, but it feels true." Ghost blinked slowly. She didn't move away, didn't break eye contact. She simply sat with him in his pain. Milo came to the fence, pressing as close as he could, purring with an intensity that seemed meant to heal. They sat together until the sun set and the temperature dropped. When George finally stood to leave, Ghost remained at the fence, watching him go. That night, George started a journal. He titled it simply Ghost, Scout, and George. He'd begun calling Milo Scout in his mind because the cat seemed to be scouting between two worlds, bridging the gap between human and wild, between loss and healing. He wrote about that first night, about the panic of searching in the rain. He wrote about seeing Scout curled against Ghost for the first time, about the slow building of trust. He documented every small miracle the day Ghost touched her nose to Scout's through the fence during a snowstorm. The time Scout used Ghost's belly as a pillow while she was sleeping. The moment Ghost arranged her body like a step so Scout could climb onto a higher rock. The staff at Mountain Haven began to recognize what was developing, though they had no name for it. It wasn't simply a leopard tolerating a domestic cat. Ghost was parenting Scout. She would groom him meticulously, teach him through gentle correction, protect him with fierce determination. When Scout would venture too far from the den, Ghost would chuff a specific sound and Scout would immediately return. Scout had learned to respond with his own call, a high-pitched mip mip that meant, "I'm here, I'm safe." Ghost began teaching Scout how to read the environment. She would freeze, ears forward, and Scout would freeze too, mimicking her. She was teaching him to listen, to sense. When she would leap gracefully from rock to rock, Scout would attempt the same jumps, sometimes succeeding, sometimes tumbling. Ghost would watch these attempts with what looked remarkably like patience, occasionally demonstrating again if Scout was struggling with a particular distance. One afternoon in January, Scout caught his paw in a crack between rocks and began crying in pain. George had been reading, but he immediately stood, calling for help. Ghost went into action mode, examining Scout carefully, making soft sounds as she tried to calm him. When Sarah and Marcus arrived with the medical kit, Ghost faced them with a warning growl. "We need to help him," Sarah said firmly but gently. "George, can you come here?" They led George through a secondary gate, providing him with protective gear, though they weren't sure it would matter if Ghost decided to attack. George approached slowly, talking the entire time. "It's okay, Ghost. We just need to look at his paw. We won't hurt him, I promise." Ghost watched him come closer, her body tense, but when George knelt beside Scout, she didn't attack. She remained inches away, watching his every move, but she allowed it. Marcus, filming everything from outside the enclosure, couldn't believe what he was seeing. "No veterinarian has ever been allowed that close to her," he breathed. "She doesn't let anyone touch her, let alone something she cares about." George carefully examined Scout's paw. It was caught, but not broken. He worked gently to free it, murmuring reassurances. Scout cried out once when the paw came free, and Ghost immediately moved closer. But George said, "He's all right. See all better." He checked for breaks or cuts, found only minor scrapes, and slowly backed away. Ghost immediately pulled Scout close, grooming him frantically, checking him over with the thoroughness of a worried parent. George returned through the gate, his heart hammering. Sarah gripped his arm. "Do you understand what just happened? She trusted you with her cub. That's, that's beyond anything I've ever witnessed." February brought a blizzard that shut down most of Montana. Roads were impassable for 3 days. George couldn't reach the sanctuary, and he paced his cabin anxiously, worried about how Ghost and Scout would interpret his absence. When he finally made it back, he found Ghost in a state he'd never seen before. The staff had recorded the incident. The day after the blizzard, Scout had somehow gotten disoriented in the heavy snow and wandered into the far corner of the enclosure, an area with poor visibility. He'd started crying, unable to find his way back. Ghost had roared not a warning or a threat, but a sound of pure alarm. She'd searched frantically, calling for Scout, until staff used thermal imaging to locate him and called her to his location using speakers. When Scout was finally back with Ghost, she'd lain over him completely, not letting him out from under her for hours. She refused food, refused to move. The staff had been genuinely concerned, but there was nothing they could do. Ghost was simply making sure Scout understood he was not to wander like that again. Now, seeing George return, Ghost approached the fence with a directness she'd never shown before. She stared at him, and George had the uncanny sense that she was telling him what had happened, sharing her fear. Scout appeared from the den, apparently recovered from his adventure, and immediately ran to greet George. "I heard you had a scary couple of days," George said softly. "I'm sorry I wasn't here. The roads were closed, but you took good care of him, didn't you? Ghost, you kept him safe." That afternoon, George watched as Ghost did something unprecedented. She brought Scout to the feeding area and, instead of eating her portion first, she deliberately pushed some of her meat toward him. Scout sniffed it, looked up at her, and began eating. Ghost waited until he was finished before starting on her own food. "She's sharing her food," Sarah said, her voice shaking. "That's explicitly maternal behavior. She's not just tolerating him. She truly believes he's her cub." As winter slowly began to release its grip, George noticed something else. Ghost had started responding to his voice even when he wasn't there. The sanctuary had begun playing recordings of George reading, using them as enrichment. Ghost would pace around the enclosure, searching for the source of the voice, occasionally making soft sounds as if trying to call him. On a warm day in early March, something extraordinary happened. George was sitting in his usual spot when Ghost approached the fence. She came closer than she ever had, until they were separated by only inches and chain link. Then she did something that made everyone watching hold their breath. Ghost pressed her massive head against the fence, pushing forward as if trying to get closer. George understood immediately. moving slowly, telegraphing every movement. He extended his hand until it was as close to her as the fence would allow. His fingers were nearly touching the fur on her forehead. "Hello, beautiful girl," he whispered. Ghost pressed harder against the fence, her eyes closing. George couldn't quite reach her. The gap was still too great, but the intention was clear. She was offering trust. She was saying, "You are part of this. You belong here too." George felt tears stream down his face. Sarah, watching from the monitoring station, was openly sobbing. Marcus had to turn away, overwhelmed from that day forward. The dynamic shifted subtly but unmistakably. Ghost no longer watched George with wariness. She watched him with something like recognition, belonging, family. Spring arrived properly in April, bringing green to the mountains and warmth to the days. George had been feeling under the weather, fighting a persistent cold that had settled into his chest. He'd pushed through it for a week, not wanting to miss his time with Ghost and Scout, but finally Sarah had insisted he stay home until he recovered. "They'll be fine for a few days," she assured him. "You need to rest." But Ghost wasn't fine. On the third day of George's absence, she became agitated, pacing constantly, barely eating. She kept returning to the spot where George usually sat, making distress calls. Scout, picking up on her anxiety, stayed close to her, trying to comfort her the way she normally comforted him. Sarah called George. "You need to come back, even if you just stay for 30 minutes. She thinks something's happened to you." George drove to the sanctuary, still feverish but unable to stay away knowing Ghost was distressed. The moment he appeared at the fence line, Ghost rushed forward. She didn't stop at her usual distance. She came right to the barrier and made a sound George had never heard from her before, a soft, complex vocalization that seemed to contain worry, relief, and reprimand all at once. "I'm sorry," George said, his voice raspy. "I was sick, but I'm okay. See, I'm still here." Ghost paced along the fence, agitated. Then she did something that brought the entire staff running. She ran out to the middle of the enclosure, gave a soft chuff, then ran back to the fence, then out and back again. She was playing. For the first time since her rescue, Ghost was exhibiting play behavior, and she was directing it at George. "I think she's scolding you," Marcus said with wonder in his voice. "She's playing, but she's also letting you know she was worried." George laughed, which turned into coughing. "I'm sorry, Ghost. I won't stay away so long again." From that day on, every evening, George would come to the sanctuary, and the three of them, George, Ghost, and Scout, would sit together. Ghost would lie near the fence. Scout would alternate between her and the barrier, and George would sit on his stone seat, sometimes reading, sometimes just watching the mountains turn gold and purple with sunset. In late May, the Mountain Haven Sanctuary Board held a special meeting. Sarah presented the situation with Ghost, Scout, and George, explaining the unprecedented nature of their bond. She proposed something unusual: permission for George to have a more permanent presence at the sanctuary. "What exactly are you suggesting?" one board member asked. "There's a small cabin on the property, originally built for overnight security. It's been unused for years. I'm suggesting we renovate it and offer it to Mr. Patterson. He could live here, be near Ghost and Scout full time. And actually, his presence has been beneficial for other animals too. Some of our more traumatized rescues have responded well to him reading near their enclosures." The board was skeptical but intrigued. They visited the sanctuary, watched the three together, read the documentation, reviewed the videos. What they saw was undeniable. A 73-year-old widower, a traumatized snow leopard, and a domestic cat had formed something that could only be called a family. The vote was unanimous. George moved into the cabin in June. It was small, one room really, with a bathroom, but it had everything he needed: a bed, a chair, a small kitchen area, and most importantly, a window and door that faced Ghost and Scout's enclosure. They were less than 30 yards away. The first morning George woke up in the cabin, he opened his door to find Ghost sitting as close to the fence as possible, Scout beside her, both of them watching his door. They'd been waiting for him. "Good morning," George called, laughing. "Give me a few minutes for coffee, and I'll be right there." The summer passed in a gentle rhythm. George would spend his mornings with Ghost and Scout, his afternoons helping around the sanctuary, and his evenings back with them, reading or simply sitting. He began bringing the blanket, the one he'd first given them, back and forth between the cabin and the enclosure. It became a shared object, carrying sense from both worlds. Ghost grew stronger, healthier. Her weight returned to normal. Her coat regained its luster. She played regularly now, teaching Scout elaborate stalking games, chasing him around the enclosure with careful gentleness. Scout, for his part, was growing into a confident young cat, no longer the frightened kitten who'd stumbled into a snow leopard's territory. But he never ventured far from Ghost. She was his anchor, his safety, and George, who had been slowly disappearing into grief and isolation, found himself part of something larger. The other sanctuary workers sought his company. Volunteers wanted to hear his stories. Children on tours would ask about the man who lives with the snow leopard, and he'd explain, carefully, about family and healing and unexpected love. One evening in September, a professional photographer came to the sanctuary, commissioned to document the animals for a fundraising campaign. She spent hours capturing images, but the photograph that would eventually define her career was almost accidental. She'd been walking past Ghost's enclosure at sunset when she saw them, George sitting in his chair reading, Scout curled in his lap, having somehow made his way through an open feeding door, and Ghost lying as close to the fence as possible, her head on her paws, watching them both with an expression of absolute contentment. The photographer captured the moment. The light was golden, everything soft-focused except for the three subjects. When the image was developed and shown to the sanctuary board, there wasn't a dry eye in the room. "That needs to be our primary fundraising image," the board president said firmly. "But more than that, it needs a caption." After much discussion, they settled on something simple. "Family is chosen, not born." The photograph went viral. News outlets picked up the story. Donations poured in. But George, Ghost, and Scout remained largely unaware of the attention. Their days continued in the rhythm they'd established. Wake, greet each other, spend the day in quiet companionship, watch the sunset together. Years passed. Scout grew from a kitten to a mature cat, but he never outgrew his bond with Ghost. Every night, without fail, he would curl against her, seeking the warmth and security he had found that first night. Ghost, defying the expectations of her veterinarians, lived far longer than anyone predicted. They attributed her longevity to happiness, to purpose, to having something to live for. George's hair went completely white, and he moved a bit slower, but his eyes remained bright. Visitors to the sanctuary would sometimes see him sitting by the fence, Scout in his lap, both of them watching Ghost with expressions of complete peace. On a mild morning in early spring, several years after that first night, a conservation worker named Jenny, who'd been hired long after the story began, stood watching them. George was reading poetry, his voice carrying across the enclosure. Ghost lay nearby, eyes half closed, listening. Scout was sprawled across a sun-warmed rock, occasionally flicking his tail. "How long have they been like this?" Jenny's supervisor, Marcus, came to stand beside her. "Since the day they found each other," Marcus said. "Ghost doesn't stare into the distance anymore. Scout doesn't wander lost. And George," he paused, watching the old man, "George isn't lonely anymore. None of them have to suffer alone." That afternoon, George brought a special treat, catnip, for Scout and for Ghost, an enrichment box filled with spices and scents she loved. He watched as Scout rolled in the catnip with abandon, becoming ridiculously goofy, and Ghost watched too, with what could only be called maternal amusement. Then she investigated her own box, rubbing against it, making sounds of contentment. "You two are the best thing that ever happened to me," George said quietly. "You know that, right?" Ghost looked at him, blinked slowly. Scout, catnip drunk, chirped happily. The three of them sat in the warm spring sun, and it was nothing extraordinary, no dramatic moments, no crisis or climax, just an old man, a traumatized leopard who'd learned to heal, and a cat who'd found his purpose in being a bridge between worlds. It was George thought. More than enough. It was everything. As the sun set that evening, painting the Montana sky in shades of orange and purple, the three of them settled into their usual positions. George in his chair, Scout beside him, Ghost as close as the fence allowed. In the distance, other animals called to each other, the sounds of the sanctuary winding down for the night. George closed his book and simply watched them, his family, chosen and cherished. Same time tomorrow, he asked. Ghost chuffed softly. Scout purred. And in that simple exchange, everything that needed to be said had been said. They were home, all three of them. Finally, completely, home. Every rescue begins with a heartbeat that refuses to give up. We're grateful you chose to listen to this one. If you'd like to hear more stories like this, a simple like or subscribe means the world to us.